A great pleasure to be here organizing this webinar in the name of the YSI Innovation Working Group. This is the first joint webinar we have with the Urban and Economics Working Group, and I would like to thank very much Igor and the Urban and Economics Working Group for organizing and inviting the professors. So we are going to have this webinar series called Innovation in a Regional Context, which is supposed to consist into 5 webinars and probably 7 until the end of October. And it's a great pleasure to have today Professor John Harrison. I would like to invite Igor, please, to present Professor John Harrison, said some words in the name of the Urban and Economics Working Group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danilo. And of course, the Economics of Innovation Working Group, it's a huge pleasure to the Urban and Economics Working Group to work together. I guess it will be a very productive partnership, and I want to thank especially Professor John Harrison for accepting our invitation. Professor John Harrison is rather in human geography at Lounghborough University, UK. He's a teacher into the urban and regional renaissance in regional studies, and he is also associate director of the Globalization and World Series Research Network. And today, Professor John Harrison will speak to us the talk Megaregions, Globalization's New Urban Form. Professor, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, if I just say sorry, Professor, and just explain how the webinar will consist. It will consist in 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, and then we can have 15 minutes of questions and answers. So if anyone has a question, please, you can either write it in the chat or open your microphones and ask the question to Professor. So Professor, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is totally yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you particularly to Danilo and Igor for the invitation and the opportunity to share this research that I've been involved in over the last maybe 4 or 5 years as part of a longer project of somebody who's interested in the way that cities and regions are being politically mobilized in the context of globalization. So what I want to start with today is firstly an acknowledgement. Those of you who can see the title slide will realize that the work that I'm presenting today is not only work that I've been involved in. I've been very heavily involved with working and collaborating with a longtime colleague, Michael Hoyler. So really what I'm presenting is the work that we've embarked on together, that we started probably a little bit longer than 5 years ago, when we first started to try and link up some of the literature and debates that he was involved in, very much linked to kind of the Globalization of World Cities research group that Loughborough is renowned for, and his kind of background in research on global cities, and my background, which is much more in regional geography or regional studies, looking at urban and regional governance. And what you'll see through this presentation, hopefully, is the coming together of 2 distinct traditions within urban and regional studies, and we see the kind of the lens of the mega region being quite important in terms of some of the things that maybe it can talk to, or what it can tell us about broader debates within globalized urbanization. So with seminars or presentations, trying to capture people's attention from when we start, this is really, I suppose, the origin or the underlying process that Michael and I are particularly interested in when we're talking about mega regions. So what you can see from the cartoon is really just an image of urbanization. So when we think about globalization, particularly as urban and regional scholars, what we're thinking about is that globalization's got a number of kind of key features, one of which is urbanization, another one is global economic integration. So what we want to do is really thinking about this idea of mega region and the kind of the larger scale city region that's become very prominent within the kind of later stages of globalization. And really what we do is reflected in this book, which the paperback version came out only a couple of days ago, where what we try to do is take the notion of the mega region and arguments being put forward by a number of predominantly economic scholars, be it people working on innovation, people working more broadly on kind of the economic drivers of the global economy, arguing that mega regions are globalization's new urban form. Now, what you'll see from the title of the book that Michael and I have edited is most importantly is the question mark. So what we wanted to do in this book was really, we were reflecting on some of the broader debates around global cities, around global city regions, new regionalism, and identifying a number of kind of questions that we had that we thought really deserved quite a bit of attention, but maybe at this stage, or the stage when we started this project 4 or 5 years ago, we thought there was a gap in the debate or that was kind of ripe for intervention. So what we want to do is really present the ideas that Michael and I have put forward, and then obviously if it's a topic that you're interested in, then there's scope there. There's other chapters that look much more at the context in North America, in China, look at other factors such as sustainability, which I'm not going to touch on today. But this was our starting point, and one of the observations we made when we looked at the literature, or were reading the literature around mega regions, is that a lot of the articles, a lot of the research would reference Jean Gottman's classic 1960s book and concept of megalopolis. But we were struck by how few people actually engaged with the arguments that were contained within that book. There was almost this sense of that mega regions were being presented as globalization's new urban form, and a sense of actually forgetting some of the intellectual history, and the sense that maybe we've actually been here before. And the important context here is to think about megalopolis in the 1960s, put forward by John Gottman, was very much at I suppose, the start when we think about the modern era of globalization, kind of moving into the 1970s. So this was really at the start of that period that I would refer to as globalization. We seem to be revisiting this concept through the idea of mega region in the mid-2000s. Well, what's interesting is when you go back and start to look at that book by Gottman, I think there's 2 things that stood out for Michael and myself when we looked at it, or when we were thinking about it. The first is the quote that you see on the screen, which is from August Heckscher, who is the director of the 20th Century Fund, which you might be aware is that they funded the research that Gottman undertook to produce the book. And in the preface to the book, you can see in the quote, he basically says that the definition, he hopes the original or the own definition will be heeded, because actually the term is so powerful that it's very easy for misconceptions to take root. So one of the things that we were thinking about with the mega region concept in the modern era or contemporary era was really the same thing. We thought that there was some misconceptions or some maybe problems or challenges with some of the fundamentals underpinning this idea. The second thing that we were aware of is that actually John Gottman didn't actually come up with, he's not the original kind of inspiration for the term megalopolis. In many ways, he was the person who popularized it in the 1960s. But you could go back into the early part of the 20th century to look at people like Patrick Geddes, who not only used the term megalopolis, but actually also refers to the same geography in terms of the northeastern seaboard of the United States. So we wanted, through the book and the work that we've been involved in, is to take I suppose, a more critical kind of perspective on the mega region concept and some of the underlying arguments. So I guess the question you might be wondering, why mega regions? And we think this is a really important question, because when we look at various concepts or spatial framings that we have to think about kind of the innovative regions or the innovative kind of city regions, urban spaces within the global economy, there are many of them. And many of you who are listening might be engaging with any number of different concepts, referring basically to globalization's new urban or regional form. So we revisited a paper by Peter Taylor, who many of you will be aware is the director of the GORC network, and Rob Lang, who at the turn of the century identified 100 concepts describing recent urban change. And what struck us is that megaregion is not present. So even maybe 2 or 3 years before the megaregion concept really comes to the fore in global urban studies, actually Peter and Robert Lang don't identify it, which we think is quite striking. When you look at some of the concepts or the terms that are on that screen, on that slide, some of them are very, very kind of strange terms there. They quickly disappear. Many of you have probably never even heard of some of them. So really the question we had is the megaregion really as important as Michael and I were thinking it was in terms of contemporary debates? Or is it one of these sort of transient concepts which may very quickly disappear? The other thing that was striking for us is Michael and I are both human geographers, albeit we engage in urban studies, which is a very interdisciplinary field, is we went to the 2 major human geography dictionaries that we both use. And again, what's striking is the term megaregion, or the concept of megaregion, is not sufficiently important or deemed sufficiently important to be included. What's interesting is megalopolis, the more historical concept, is. So what's the argument? Why are people interested in megaregions? Why did we want to kind of make an intervention into this kind of debate? And it goes back to that process of kind of globalized urbanization. So if we look back over the last 10 or 15 years, my origin as a researcher was around city regions. So I was very heavily influenced by engagement with Alan Scott's book, Global City Regions, from 2001. And what's striking here is the global city regions that he identifies as kind of globalization's new urban regional form range from anywhere over 1 million in terms of population up to 28 million, which is Tokyo. And he identifies somewhere in the region of about 600 urban spaces, which are seen to be at the cutting edge of the global economy, the places that urban and regional economic innovation, the cutting edge economy is located. Now, I don't want to linger and go through this slide step by step, but what I want to illustrate is that as we go through time, what you'll see is that the scale of these urban regions is getting bigger. And this is simply underpinned by urbanization and arguments around agglomeration economies and the idea that bigger is better when you think about kind of economic units. So you'll see this is from 2007, this is the OECD talking about metro regions. And here they identify, I think it's somewhere about 78 of these metro regions. So the scale is getting slightly bigger and the number is decreasing. In 2008, Richard Florida started to utilize the term megaregion. And in his book, again, you can see that the size, the threshold you had to be as an urban area to be included is going up. It's now 3.7 million, which is Tokyo or Helsinki, I think. But the scale at the top end is going up when you think about the Pearl River Delta. Whereas Alan Scott was referring to maybe 600 global city regions, by the time we get to Richard Florida and megaregions, we're down to only 40. Likewise, you move forward a couple of years, United Nations Habitat, in their State of the World Cities report, the threshold now to be classed as a kind of a megaregion is 20 million. And we're talking again a smaller number. In 2011, there was a news article referring to the Pearl River Delta, identifying 260 million. And you could even go as far as the kind of fashionable debate about planetary urbanization being led by Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt. But I think that it's the broader trend. That's how we've arrived in terms of the spatial framing of globalized urbanization at the idea of megaregions. So we think that's one of the reasons why it's a prominent concept and why, as researchers, there's been quite a lot of, I suppose, questions and debate taking place about the megaregion concept. So let me get to the question, why megaregions? So if you to look at the literature, some of the literature I've just cited there isn't a question. So it's not megaregions, globalization's new urban form, question mark. For these academics or proponents of megaregions, It's a definitive statement that megaregions are globalization's new urban form. And what you'll see there is from the quotes is from papers by Richard Florida and colleagues about the rise of the megaregion, also his 2008 book. And what I want to try and illustrate with these quotes from the words that are highlighted in the red text is that this is very much an economic argument. So the argument that megaregions represent globalization's new urban form is underpinned by a geo-economic logic, an economic logic that says innovation, agglomeration, that is where the global economy exists. It's where globalization crystallizes out on the ground, and that these are the most competitive economic units. So you can see there from the quote from Richard Florida, for example, the world's largest 40 megaregions, the world's 40 largest megaregions produce 2/3 of global economic output and more than 8 in 10 of the world's innovation. It's an argument underpinned by the sorts of debates that you will be engaged in thinking about innovation and where it's located in the global economy. It's also being picked up, as you can see by the UN Habitat quote, the same argument that basically these are the engines of the global economy. And what this results in is the production of maps trying to identify where these megaregions exist. So in the top left-hand corner, the Regional Plan Association in the United States produced this map in about 2006, 2007, of what they identified as the emerging megaregions. So what they identified as the megaregions that were going to drive the US economy up to 2050. Similarly, the other three slides in the top right and then the two at the bottom are taken from Richard Florida's work, identifying megaregions in the top right in North America, in the bottom left in Europe, and in the bottom right, Southeast, Eastern Asia. And what strikes us from these maps is firstly that you get different maps. So the question of where is very much different depending on who's constructing the maps of where these megaregions are. But crucially, these regions, if you want to call them that, are being defined by economics. It's about an economic logic, it's about agglomeration. There's no real sense of the political aspect of how megaregions are constructed. And so what we wanted to do when we were observing these maps, and you can probably, the two to look at are in the top right or the bottom left, is just the nature of how these regions are named. So you can see places like Houston and New Orleans being brought together, and an argument that bringing these two sort of what you might call global city regions together in a mega region is somehow elevating it as a more important kind of economic unit as a mega region. And one of the things that struck me as a European academic working in the UK is that, for example, the one that is in England that you can see is called Lun-Leigh-Chester is not something that I recognise as a mega region. So it started me thinking, and Michael, my colleague, about how these mega regions were being constructed, and started to ask some of the critical questions about the logic by which these were being put forward as kind of globalization's new urban form. For example, if you look at Italy, any of you know the kind of Italian economy will know that there's a very clear north-south divide in Italy, yet when you look at, say, Florida's diagram here, all of Italy is included. So it raised some questions that we wanted to address. So the question is really, what about the politics? And when we say politics here, we're talking politics with a small p, really referring to motivation. What is the motivation behind promoting mega regions, as well as the kind of the economic arguments? So one example we looked at was this America 2050, launched by the RPA, launched in 2005 and identifies these mega regions. What we were interested in was why. Why did the Regional Plan Association suddenly decide that mega regions were an important way to frame it? And what we started to realize when we started to delve into it is it wasn't simply about this economic argument about globalization's new urban form. It wasn't simply about innovation. It wasn't simply about the global economy. It was actually motivated by internal and external pressures. So the internal pressure was the RPA were responding to what they perceived to be a lack of federal action to identify and bring forward investments to reform physical infrastructure. So what they were looking at is how an argument forward to try and convince the Department of Transportation in the US to invest more in physical infrastructure. And I asked if any of you are interested in this, go and have a look at the America 2050 website, because when you look at it, it's all about high-speed rail. So it's not a holistic economic development strategy. Megaregions here, America 2050 is about one particular argument, which is about federal investments in high-speed rail. So that's an internal issue that the RPA were facing, but it's also framed in terms of an. So what you see is that this belief that they were being left behind by their competitors in Europe and Asia, who were seen to be investing in high-speed rail infrastructure. The other example I'll point to here is the United Nations Habitat, and I apologise for the quality of the image on the slide, but this is the quality of the image that appeared in their State of the World Cities reports. And what was really important, I think, and what the observation we made when we looked at that document, was that it wasn't really the state of the world cities when they were referring to megaregions, because they only identified in the text and in the narrative those that were in the global south. So when you think about the United Nations Habitat, its remit as a very much focused on development, very heavily focused on the global south and the developing economies and countries of the world. When they put this argument forward that megaregions and urban corridors were kind of the drivers of the global economy and going to help assist development in the global south, they identified those in China, those in India, those in sub-Saharan Africa, those in South America, but they never drew attention to the fact that there were megaregions in North America or Western Europe. They were very clearly articulating and creating a story that was focusing on how megaregions could help the global south develop, but ignoring the fact that megaregions were very prominent in terms of economic argument. Okay, so they have the map that you can see that exists in Europe and North America, but when you read the text, there is no reference to it. Again, it's being constructed for political purposes. Again, you can look at other things here. So I highlight this example just to show other work that happened in the US at the same time, identifying megaregions. The key point here is generally the geographies are fairly similar, but they're given different names. But really this work is significant, I think, because again, it gives you a sense of how the concept is being politically constructed. So these are the 10 megapolitan or megaregions that they identify. And they have a definition which is involves having a population of 10 million by the year, I think it's 2025. And what struck us is the two megapolitan areas that don't currently have that. So those are the two at the bottom of this screen, so Cascadia and Valley of the Sun. And we started to think, well, why didn't they just identify those that have got a population of 10 million at the moment? Why have they constructed a definition about projected into the future? So Cascadia is interesting because Cascadia is the region that straddles the northwest of America, goes into the southwestern part of Canada. It has a strong independence movement, very strong regional identity, very strong lobbying as a political action, kind of a political regionalism group. So you can imagine that they were very active in terms of making sure that their voice was heard. But the one that's really interesting is Valley of the Sun. So this is Arizona, it's Phoenix, it's where the high-tech kind of boom is going on in the United States. So if they hadn't created a definition that was, say, projecting forward to 2025, the Valley of the Sun wouldn't meet the criteria. So it's as if they've created a definition to make sure that they can include the high growth region of the United States. Because can you imagine constructing a narrative about megaregions being the new urban form, kind of competitive in the US, and not including Arizona, Phoenix, and the kind of the development that was going there? So it seems that there's some sort of construction or political with a small p going on in terms of how megaregions were being constructed. So in terms of our research, what we wanted to do is move beyond questions of definition and delimitation. So where are megaregions? What are they? To understand questions about agency. So who or what is mobilizing this megaregion concept? How are they doing it? And why are they doing it? So in whose interests? So the first thing we try to do is try to actually define what we meant by a megaregion. How does it differentiate from, say, a global city region or a mega city region? So what we've identified, and the definition that we used, was this idea of two or more interrelated urban systems is something that we thought was a useful way of defining a megaregion. But we also thought it was really important to think about why megaregions now, why in globalization? Because actually megaregions have come in and out of focus over the course of the 20th century. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Patrick Geddes used the term megalopolis, as did Lewis Mumford, but importantly, it was a negative. Megaregion or megalopolis wasn't something to aspire to, it's actually something, it was the tipping point at which cities had become too big and were about to go into decline. In the 1960s in the United States, the geography changes, so it's not Europe now, we're talking the United States. This is where we get John Gottman with his kind of modernist and progressive view of the new urban form, and this is where the concept gets popularized. What's interesting in many of these debates currently about megaregions is the complete, I suppose, overlooking of what happened in Europe in the 1980s, where people were referred to the kind of the blue banana or the Pentagon, which is I put on the slide. This is what the blue banana looks like. This idea of a kind of urban corridor running through the backbone of Europe, or more recently the version which is the Pentagon, which is these 5 cities. That know the kind of the blue banana concept, again, very heavily politically constructed by French geographers to identify how Paris wasn't in this. So if you do some research on that, we do talk about it in the introduction to the book. This served a political purpose as much as it was underpinned by an economic argument. In the 1990s, the focus switches to is derived from population. So what we think is the important bit is that megaregions is being marked out because for the first time it's become a truly global concept. But we think also there's very different variations in terms of how they're defined and how they're approached. So in the US in particular, but elsewhere, there's this idea of if you take urban form or rapid urbanization as the kind of key feature of globalization, you get one type of kind of definition of a megaregion and where they are. They function like megaregions, or these areas function like megaregions because they look like megaregions. Conversely, in Europe, there's research that's taken the opposite approach and almost gone function first and taken global economic integration as the starting point. But the observation here is that form doesn't always follow function. So there's places that might function like a megaregion economically, but don't look like a megaregion. And there seems to be these two different approaches to megaregions. So here's the example, and it will link into broader urban debates, is that this is an area that doesn't look like a megaregion. It's the complete antithesis of what you'd imagine a megaregion to look like. But actually that research in the 2000s identified that northern Switzerland actually was functioning very much like a megaregion in terms of its connectivity and its kind of economic linkages. And what's interesting is this is actually where quite a lot of the planetary urbanization work of people like Christian Schmidt emerges from, is observations in these types of regions. So we think that the whole idea about how we engage with megaregions is important, depending on whether you take a kind of urban form as your starting point, or whether you take economic function as your starting point. So what I want to finish with in the last couple of minutes is 3 examples of places that seem to fall off the megaregion map and what the consequences maybe are for those. So the first story, or the first vignette here, is about the Calibargia binational megaregion initiative, which emerged really maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and identifies what we think about some of these questions that we should be thinking about in terms of the arguments about megaregions. So in the first quote, you get the sense that Tijuana, which is on the kind of is on the fringes economically of the Southern Californian megaregion. It's only 100 125 miles away from Los Angeles, but it's completely politically excluded from the, despite only being, or by being 1 mile south of the US-Mexican border. So on the face of it, they are disempowered by the discourse of US mega regions. However, by expanding to include Los Angeles, not only can they bring the outside in to make the case stronger for a Calibargia mega region, it takes the inside out, because Calibargia will be, by the same token, part of an already existing mega region. So that political aspect of where's included, where's not, is really important. But the second quote about the who, why, and how, why do Calibargia, why does the chairman of the Tijuana Economic Development Corporation want to be part of a mega region? Well, the first sentence is important because it reveals that mega regions are not an official state policy in many contexts. It's up to other people who are constructing them. And the final sentence about it makes people listen to what you have to say, and what is really, what we would argue is the ultimate goal of mega regions as a political project, which is about exerting influence in and through mega regions. It's about attracting investment, it's about attracting political investment, it's investing in the region. So the open question that this example and many others highlight is, who are the people? Who are the people that are promoting this? What is or whose is the message that's being promoted? So you can see here's a very strong economic development argument, and perhaps most critical of all, who stands to gain the most or lose as a result. The second example, again, is a US example from Hampton Roads, Richmond, and this is so Virginia, and the key here is their strategic position between two mega regions. They're 100 miles to the north of, 100 miles to the north of Richmond is Washington, DC, and the southern tip of the kind of northeast mega region, or Gottman's megalopolis. And to the south is Raleigh, the northernmost city in the Piedmont Atlantic mega region. So they're strategically positioned sort of in between or on the fringes. But they take a very different approach to Calibargia. So Calibargia's approach is to try and create a formal mega region. They want to be part of the political landscape. But the approach favoured here by business leaders in Hampton Roads implies seeking the benefits of operating like a mega region in an economic sense, but without the formality of being a mega region in a political sense. So the question is not simply sort of the question is not always where, why, and how actors choose to engage in mega regions, but why some actors choose not to be part of this landscape, or why they choose not to engage as much as others. So they're basically adopting very different strategies, but they both respond to this same feeling of being disempowered by mega regionalism and globalized urbanization more broadly. But their different strategies aspire to much the same outcome, i.e. to create a mechanism which can lobby on behalf of certain capitalist interests. So really what these reveal is that the appeal of mega regions is not only the end goal, it's effectively, it seems to be that mega regions and the economic argument behind them provide a narrative or a storyboard on which local issues are played out, i.e. how to attract and influence other people. The third and final one that I want to identify is what we refer to as Parlon, the link between Paris and London. And the quote here is revealing because by standard definitions, i.e. Florida's 20 million population, Paris already has the critical mass to consider itself a mega region. So why is it reaching out to London to try and identify and create this idea of a mega region? Again, it's political. So Anne Hidalgo, this is the quote that she wrote, Hidalgo was positioning herself for the forthcoming elections as a future mayor with a global outlook. She's projecting against a background where the Socialist Party she represents is as was President Francois Hollande, implementing a super tax against employers, employers paying high salaries. And there's a big fear within Paris that this super tax would spark an exodus of wealthy French millionaires from Paris to London. So there's a context here, it's a political context of why the mega region concept is being mobilized at a particular time. And it came after, this quote came a few days after she told a group of reporters how London is in some ways a suburb of Paris. So it's really what we arrive at is kind of the competitive positioning of Paris vis-a-vis London, clearly giving way to what can be interpreted as a conciliatory move to try and create a kind of more cooperative spirit between London and Paris, between Hidalgo and Boris Johnson, who was the mayor of London at the time. But basically, it suggests that the mobilization of the mega-region concept owes more to French politics than it does to anything about planning or governing at the mega-region scale. So again, if you want to put it bluntly, the mega-region is not the story in this example, it's the vehicle for communicating another story to its chosen audience. And that's what we think is really happening with mega-regions. It's taking this economic argument to try and communicate certain stories about whether it's high-speed rail in the US, whether it's political maneuvering here in the case of Paris. So what we want to try and argue here and to sort of open up an engagement and dialogue around mega-regions and sort of the economic argument is really trying to think about mega-regions in a more critical way, about what is the narrative that's being promoted when this economic argument or logic is being put forward. So for us, the key question is like how the mega-region concept is being constructed or mobilized to fit particular stories as the kind of crucial yet somewhat unresearched dimension of mega-region research. So what we want to do is try and move this debate forward from kind of the obvious questions about what are mega-regions, where are they, why do we have mega-regions, to questions of agency, process and specific interests. So that's where we see the debate going and where we'd like to see engagement from other researchers. And then finally, this is not I suppose, a critique of kind of the economic arguments surrounding mega-regions. But we would see that the kind of what we need to do is open up the debate to include kind of a more political, more historical, as well as more economic perspective on mega-regions to really take this debate forward. So thank you very much for listening and for kind of engaging. I'm very keen to hear the questions or the comments that you might have on this research. But just to say again, if you are interested, there is a book that's just come out in paperback only a few days ago. And if you go on the Elgar, Edward Elgar, the publisher website, you can download the first chapter that Michael and I wrote, but for free. So there's opportunity to kind of engage with the detail of the arguments that I've tried to put forward today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison. Igor, do you want to say something?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to do a question, a first question. The emergency of the mega regions that you brought here brings several challenges to the local and regional governance. There's a bigger scale of regions, and this rapid urbanizations bring several challenges, and I would like to hear about these challenges, the new challenges that emerge with this rapid urbanization and this new scale of regions, as well as the implications of the several measures of austerity that have been taken both in nation and local levels around the world. Here in Brazil, we have many measures of austerity that have been taken, including in the city level.
Sorry, just to, if anyone wants to make a question to Professor Harrison, please feel free to write the question here in the chat, or you can actually write them to me, or you can just put your name and then we can organize a queue of questions so Professor can actually have time to think and answer all of them. And also I'd like to thank Professor Harrison for this very interesting webinar. And I have a question as well, but Professor, would you prefer to answer Igor's question first and then answer the other one, or to get all the questions together?
Yeah, if I take your question now, and I'll answer those two questions together.
Okay, thank you. It's actually a very simple question. I'd like to ask you if you see differences when you actually use the concept of mega region, applying it to developed countries and to developing ones, because I'm thinking in the difference between economic links, as you mention the case of the north of Switzerland, where you see that it looks like a rural area, but actually it has a lot of economic links that characterize itself as a mega region. And so the concept is not related only to agglomeration and only to big cities. For instance, you can see the cases of Mexico City, Sao Paulo, or Lagos in Nigeria, where you have extremely big cities, but actually the links are not that clear among the different regions around the city. So I'd like to ask a little bit more if you could talk about the difference in this concept concerning developed and developing niches. And thank you so much.
Yes, well, thank you very much for those comments and the questions. Just going back to Igor's first, yeah, local and regional governance, that is my background. So that's where my research and interest in this comes from. So I've got probably 3 or 4 kind of comments or responses to that. The first one that's quite striking is that there aren't institutions really representing these mega regions. So I know in the UK there's some initiatives at the moment referred to as, say, the Northern Powerhouse, which is, I wouldn't necessarily call it a mega region, but there is a strategy for that kind of large-scale urban region. What's quite striking when you look at the map and when you think about, say, some of the large Chinese mega regions that I'm doing some work on at the moment, there may be one strategy policy document, but there's not very much depth in terms of there being institutions of governance or planning at the mega region scale. So that's one of the things that's quite interesting for us, is that these concepts become very prominent within academic debates, within kind of what you might call global policy environments in terms of UN Habitat and some of the other things like the OECD. But really, when you think about it, are there any structures at the mega region scale, or is it just a narrative, a story? And we would kind of go towards the story aspect of it rather than this being a really big institutional, a scale of institutional action and kind of representation. The other comments I'll say there is Michael Glass has a chapter in the book where he talks about fragmented governance. He goes into this in quite a lot of depth. But I think Stephen Wheeler really, I suppose, hits the nail on the head. He's got a quote in his chapter where he says, we cannot plan at the regional scale, or something along the lines of, how do we think we could ever plan at the mega regional scale? So there's this trend about kind of bigger is better, but it really does pose fundamental questions about planning, governance at this kind of scale, and whether, in effect, like this is getting back towards kind of national planning rather than regional scale planning. And then the other one I'd point to is Alex Shafran. He's made a distinction which I think is really useful between what he calls mega regional space, which is the kind of the big envelope. It's the mega regions on those maps. But he says these mega regions are not homogeneous. They're not. It's not that the mega region or the process of mega regionality impacts all of that space equally. It might be a specific part or place within a mega region that really is connected in. So there's a useful distinction that gets in the local and regional aspect, as well as the thinking about the global and the big picture. In terms of the second question, I think that's a really useful one. I think it's something that Michael and I are very conscious of with the book. We did intend to have chapters talking about the context in the global south. Unfortunately, that for different reasons that wasn't possible. What I would refer to, and this is something that emerged in my work on city regions, is I think when you look at the literature on city regions more broadly as a broader debate, there are 3 different definitions which appear in the literature. One defines city regions or mega regions based on agglomeration. So it's this idea of, and a bit like the cartoon about expansion, and it's very much agglomeration. It's spatially selective in terms of it's very much a cities first approach, and clearly certain areas are included, certain areas are excluded. The second definition in the literature is the idea that a city region or a mega region is a scale. So one of the things that you find with city regions is that when you want to include everywhere, you reconstruct or you mobilize the city region as kind of a scalar concept that's somewhere above the local level, somewhere below the national level. But there's ways, in research that I've done in the UK, in Germany, and other places, it's a way of serving a different political purpose. And then the third one, which you refer to in some ways is the connections, is that there's a functional definition of city regions or mega regions, and this can be idea of the definition I often use is like the hub and spokes model. So you've got a hub, which could be a city or cities, and then you've got these spokes coming out about how they function. These three all exist in the literature, and they do around mega regions as well. The key is, are they complementary? So why do certain actors mobilize different definitions, or even the same actor mobilize different definitions to serve different political purposes? And I think that's really important in the context of the developing world, because it's too easy just to say Lagos is a big city, it must function, have lots of functions, because it's to ask those critical questions of not simply because something looks like an urban region, does it function like one? So really, it's to kind of, that starting point is really important because it does dictate what you find. And what we're really calling for is a bit more of an appreciation of both urbanization or agglomeration and function and the politics they're coming at it from.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the answers. And we have another question for Mandar. Mandar, would you like to ask your question using your microphone?
Yeah, is it okay? I'm audible?
Yes, please feel free to ask it. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the presentation, Professor. I have a question actually. If I draw kind of parallel from Saskin's work, and you have already just mentioned in the second answer to the second question that there are these definitions of city regions, and we have had the Saskin defining like global cities and global. So if we think in that line about the mega regions, are we going to say that there's a new kind of urban form, of course, which is coming and which is trying to actually define the global system in a different perspective? So for example, if you look at the hierarchies of the city regions and the way they are connected and how the economic activity takes place, the mega regions are going to change that structure in some way or the other, or are they simply just the new urban forms and increasing, scale, and somewhere they're overlapping with the global cities? How is it that the mega regions are different from the hitherto definitions of global cities and world cities, where the academicians have used to define in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s? So just I'm more interested in to understand the role that the mega regions are going to play in the globalization. Are they going to change the whole economic structure of the cities who have been dominating in different areas such as finance or Singapore, like, which is a hub for transportation using the sea links? So what is it that we actually think that mega regions can play a key role in this whole thing? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. I think the major thing just to say in terms of the connection, but also the disconnect with global cities or world cities, and you referred specifically to sort of 1970s, 1980s there. When we think about global cities, we think it's predominantly their external relations. So if you read Saskia Sassen's work from the classic stuff about global cities are defined by their external relations. It's their connection to cities globally, and that seems to give them their kind of prominent role. If you go to the literature from, say, the 2000s, connecting into Alan Scott, also work around the idea of, say, the polycentric metropolis that's become prominent over the last 10 or 15 years, that changes the global cities debate from external relations to external and internal relations. So it's how these cities, say, London is connected to other cities, not just New York or Paris or Beijing, but how it's connected to cities, say, within each region. So that's one of the important things, I suppose, that relationship. I think the thing that we would say is that fundamentally, you could argue that nothing has changed in terms of mega regions, because all the mega region is in the way that some people define it, is just putting 2 or 3 global cities together that are located geographically close together and making them look like a bigger kind of mega region or urban form. So yes, there's urbanization, definitely. You can't deny there's not urbanization and expanding outwards to form take on a kind of larger extended urbanization landscape. But if you look at the definitions or the way that these are constructed, is quite often there's not a sense of that these actually function like mega regions. It's simply, okay, all right, there's 3 or 4 global cities or global city regions located closer together. Well, they must be functioning together. There's that sort of implicit aspect that they function together. So rather than thinking about how mega regions restructure the way we think about the system of the global economy, I think it's more important to think about the politics of how they're being defined and whether they actually, like you could argue, are these mega regions constructed meaningful in any essential sense? And our argument will be is that there's research on kind of polycentric metropolis and etc. But promoting mega regions, there isn't the evidence per se to say that they function like mega regions in terms of that kind of idea about the urban system or the global economic system as it's kind of mobilized and seen connected through cities. So that would be our kind of take on that, I think.
Thank you so much, Professor, for answering the questions. And Professor said that you wanted to leave like 10 minutes before 7, right? So now we can.
I can probably do one more question if there's one.
Okay, so we can have one more question if anyone wants to ask a question. Please feel free. You can open your microphone or. So.
Professor, I would like to ask you about which are the consequences of the emergency of this new urban forum on the innovation process and the competitiveness of the firms in this new scenario, in this new model of regions, and because there are implications about the relations of the regions with the national system, and as well as the international system, and which are the implications, the advantages, and the mega regions to this process of competitiveness and innovation within the city and the region.
Okay, so I think a couple of, I suppose, responses in answer to that question. I think the first, there's a whole literature who work on innovation studies, and I wouldn't sit here today and say that I'm the expert on innovation and the kind of geographies of that. So there's clearly very clear arguments about kind of regional innovation. So what I want to do is probably stay a little bit away from that and kind of put my, I suppose, go back, answer that question from the perspective that I think of it as, which is the innovation that goes on in mega regions. There's nothing that I see in literature at the moment about mega regions that really says that by planning or governing or thinking about mega regions is going to have a direct impact on innovation. What you're getting in literature about mega regions is this is where innovation takes place, underpinned by all those arguments about regional innovation that we're all familiar with, and that's why mega regions are important. There's nothing that I see in the literature that says by thinking mega regionally that innovation is going to necessarily be increased, improved, etc. Okay, so I think that's one aspect of this. The aspect that I think is important in the context of innovation goes back to this idea of the narrative and the kind of persuasion, because the arguments that are being put forward is about infrastructure. So infrastructure that goes into regions. So the argument I would say is that because these are the mega regions that have been identified, if this is where federal investment is concentrated, then the infrastructure that's required for cutting edge industries, innovation, for expansion if there's more of that money going into these mega regions to sustain that and to enhance it, that's where the impact on innovation may come. That's because I suppose my background and insight into this is really coming from the political aspect rather than the economic argument. So I would defer to the literature on regional innovation to answer the question directly in terms of consequences. But I think from what I'm trying to present here and refer to is it's about that infrastructure, about investment, it's about attracting more firms and using the mega region story as a way to attract more firms, bigger firms, more investments, which obviously will help fuel innovation.
Professor John Harrison, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation and for answering all our questions. It was a great pleasure having you in our webinar, and I think we had a great starting first step in our webinar series. So I appreciate, and in the name of the YSI Innovation Working Group and on the YSI Urban Economics Working Group, I think we both are extremely happy for having you here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to everyone that's accessed the presentation and put forward questions. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your series over the year ahead.
Thank you very much. We, as Professor just said, we have this session recorded,